The terrifying, heavy mathematical reality of human consciousness violently and aggressively shifts completely overnight. Highly calibrated, intricately geometric neurological mapping suddenly and perfectly proves that REM sleep is not a biological hallucination. It is an absolute, heavy, and mathematically perfect quantum tether, violently connecting the fragile human brain entirely to parallel universes. Every single bizarre, fragmented geometric dream you have ever perfectly experienced is mathematically verified as a heavy, entirely authentic physical reality, perfectly occurring completely in an alternate dimension. The delicate pink human brain is violently exposed entirely as a heavy, terrifying cosmic radio, aggressively tuned perfectly to the exact geometric frequency of alternate selves. The beautiful, comforting illusion of the safe subconscious is violently, entirely, perfectly murdered. Humanity mathematically realizes they are violently and completely trapped perfectly inside a massive, heavy, terrifyingly inescapable multiverse observation chamber entirely against their absolute will.
The absolute heavy psychological horror violently and aggressively entirely executes completely when humanity mathematically processes the true geometric nature of a nightmare. These are no longer perfectly safe, heavy biological stress responses, perfectly fading entirely upon waking. When you violently and aggressively dream of falling entirely into a pitch-black void, being mathematically chased perfectly by a heavy, dark geometric shadow, or violently, perfectly dying entirely, you are mathematically completely witnessing it happen. The fragile pink brain violently and perfectly entirely forces you to completely mathematically experience the absolute heavy kinetic trauma and violent death of your alternate self. You are entirely violently paralyzed, mathematically locked perfectly inside their heavy, dark geometric perspective completely, as they are aggressively, violently, entirely, perfectly murdered. The heavy, terrifying concept of a bad dream is violently, perfectly, completely eradicated, aggressively replaced entirely, perfectly by the absolute mathematical reality of cosmic snuff films.
The survivor's guilt. Waking up perfectly inside the heavy, flat, dark gray geometric baseline reality violently, aggressively, entirely mutates perfectly from a beautiful relief into an entirely heavy, terrifying psychological torture. The fragile human conscience is violently and aggressively, entirely, perfectly crushed completely under the massive, heavy mathematical weight of absolute cosmic survivor's guilt. You aggressively and violently, completely, perfectly wake up entirely safe, mathematically realizing with heavy, absolute geometric certainty that your alternate self actually physically, perfectly experienced the violent, heavy trauma perfectly. You mathematically, completely abandon them entirely to a heavy, terrifying geometric death completely inside the dark void perfectly. The heavy, inescapable, violent mathematical truth entirely, aggressively, completely destroys the fragile pink human mind perfectly. You are completely, perfectly, mathematically forced entirely to violently, aggressively live entirely with the heavy, inescapable psychological blood of your parallel selves completely on your hands perfectly. The existential envy. The terrifying psychological nightmare violently and aggressively perfectly deepens completely, perfectly, entirely when the human mind mathematically, completely, perfectly experiences a beautiful, highly vibrant dream perfectly, entirely. You violently and aggressively, entirely, perfectly witness an alternate self perfectly achieving absolute, heavy geometric success, completely finding perfect romantic love entirely, or mathematically perfectly unlocking their greatest potential. Waking perfectly up violently entirely forces the heavy, inescapable geometric realization completely entirely that you are the mathematically completely failed timeline perfectly. The absolute heavy existential envy violently, perfectly, aggressively entirely crushes the simple black geometric stickman completely perfectly. All heavy, beautiful human ambition is entirely, violently, perfectly, entirely eradicated entirely. Completely, aggressively, perfectly suffocated entirely, perfectly, entirely by the massive, absolute mathematical proof entirely, perfectly, completely that a better version of you perfectly exists completely, perfectly, entirely.
The neurological bleed over. The delicate, highly calibrated pink human brain is mathematically, entirely, and completely not perfectly built to aggressively process heavy, entirely dual physical timelines perfectly simultaneously. The heavy, absolute geometric memories from the alternate multiverse violently and aggressively overlap perfectly with the flat, dark gray baseline reality completely perfectly. The fragile geometric boundary separating the physical present from the terrifying parallel dream state violently and aggressively collapses entirely. People completely, mathematically, perfectly forget if they actually committed a heavy, violent geometric crime in the waking world, or perfectly, entirely witnessed it completely inside the parallel void. This heavy, violent neurological bleed over aggressively, perfectly, entirely destroys the absolute concept of individual human identity perfectly, completely, entirely, perfectly. The mind violently, perfectly, aggressively shatters perfectly, entirely, perfectly into hundreds of heavy, terrifyingly fragmented geometric timelines, completely, entirely, perfectly, overlapping perfectly, entirely, perfectly.
The Insomnia Epidemic. To mathematically and perfectly avoid the heavy, terrifying psychological torture of the parallel multiverse entirely, humanity violently and aggressively refuses perfectly to sleep. A colossal, entirely, completely heavy global epidemic of absolute geometric insomnia violently, completely, aggressively sweeps perfectly across the entire flat, dark gray human civilization. People violently and aggressively mathematically consume entirely toxic geometric stimulants perfectly, entirely, to force their fragile pink brains to remain completely, entirely, perfectly awake, perfectly, completely. However, the delicate biological human engine mathematically, completely, entirely, perfectly requires absolute heavy REM sleep entirely, perfectly to survive entirely. The heavy, inescapable biological clock violently, perfectly, aggressively, completely, entirely forces them entirely to perfectly, perfectly crash entirely. Society violently, perfectly, aggressively, completely, mathematically, entirely, perfectly, violently, perfectly trades absolute heavy physical biological organ failure entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely, completely for completely, perfectly avoiding entirely, perfectly, entirely the heavy cosmic nightmare perfectly.
The Reality Dissociation. The flat, perfectly structured, heavy dark gray human megacities are violently and aggressively plunged perfectly into absolute geometric madness completely. Severe, heavy biological sleep deprivation violently, perfectly, aggressively, entirely, completely triggers entirely terrifying, heavy waking hallucinations perfectly across the globe, perfectly, entirely, completely. The heavy, absolute parallel universes violently and aggressively, entirely, completely bleed perfectly straight into the waking physical world perfectly, entirely, completely. The entirely, completely, perfectly exhausted human minds violently, perfectly, completely, entirely, perfectly, completely attack completely, perfectly, entirely innocent bystanders perfectly, entirely, perfectly, completely. They are completely, perfectly, entirely, mathematically, completely, perfectly unable to entirely, perfectly, completely distinguish the heavy, entirely, completely physical present perfectly, entirely, perfectly from completely, perfectly, entirely terrifying parallel cosmic threats perfectly. The heavy geometric reality of human civilization violently, perfectly, completely, entirely shatters perfectly, entirely, perfectly.
The multiversal catatonia. The terrifying, heavy, mathematical global violence perfectly, entirely, finally settles into a completely heavy, inescapable, pitch-black geometric silence entirely, perfectly across the dark void. The entire human species is completely, violently paralyzed, mathematically unable to function entirely, perfectly. The delicate, highly fragile pink human brains violently and aggressively, completely, perfectly, entirely lock into a permanent, heavy, geometric dual state perfectly, entirely, completely, entirely of overlapping cosmic timelines perfectly. Humanity perfectly, entirely, completely sits, entirely frozen perfectly on the perfectly flat, heavy, dark gray geometric floor entirely, completely, perfectly. They mathematically, perfectly, entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely, entirely refuse to entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely, completely, perfectly, entirely